Welcome to the Breakthrough Moments podcast, a podcast where challenges meet opportunities. I'm Harold, and together with my co-host Lasse, we explore stories of innovators, leaders, professionals, and entrepreneurs and how they turn obstacles into game-changing breakthroughs. Get ready for insights that inspire and lessons that last. Subscribe now and let's dive into the moments that define success. Welcome to today's episode of the Breakthrough Moments podcast. Today we have Dr. Anouar El Haji on with us as a guest. Anwar is a seasoned entrepreneur and academic, dedicated in transforming pricing strategy through a scientific lens. As the founder and CEO of Veilinx, he has led groundbreaking efforts in behavioral insights, helping companies like Fortune 500 firms understand what customers truly are willing to pay by using Nobel Prize-winning methodologies, amongst others. He's also driven force behind RevFixer, aiming to turn pricing into a growth lever for businesses by utilizing innovative strategies to reduce churn and increase revenue. Today, Dr. Anwar shares his journey of blending academia with real-world business to reshape how companies think about pricing. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Anwar.
Thank you for having me.
So we have had a conversation previously to this where you've told me all about pricing and behavioral psychology behind it, your origin in academia, the transition to business. But for the people that don't know you, could you give us a brief background?
Yeah, definitely. I'm someone who actually never intended to become an entrepreneur. I very much was keen on pursuing an academic career to become a researcher, a professor, and I wasn't even sure what field I wanted to focus in. So I went into economics, and within economics I became quite interested in this subfield called microeconomics, where you have these beautiful models where we assume a rational acting person, and that's how we are able to explain what happens in the economy. And then you can use straightforward models to understand what you can expect. Now, the thing is, and this was a big revolution a number of decades ago, is that psychology is everything except for rational and logical. So those models, they break down. And then psychology started to play a bigger and bigger role within economics. And this is exactly the field that got me very fascinated, behavioral economics. And within the subfield of behavioral economics, there is this focus on pricing. And pricing is a very interesting subject matter because it is the place where you expect people to be the most rational, because it's about their money in their own wallet. They feel the pain, they feel the gain when it comes to money in their own pocket. So from that lens, I started to look at pricing behavior, but purely from an academic point of view. Now, there are numerous insights within academia that turned out to be very relevant actually within the world of business. But as I learned more about the world of business, I was shocked how little is actually based on academic grounding, academic methodologies. So it felt like very messed up. Like, wait a minute, I'm in research to have a better understanding of reality, but also not for my own sake, but also to have an impact. And at the same time, I'm finding out that businesses have no clue what they're doing when it comes to understanding pricing, purchase behavior, and as a result, making incredibly costly mistakes. And that brought me to a crossroads at some point where, am I gonna continue to be a scientist in academia, or do I want to become a scientist as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I remember you mentioned that, like the transition that businesses don't have a clue, and I was like, it's interesting because when academia is known for everything is rooted in trial and error and testing, having a hypothesis, testing it, figuring out, and creating a conclusion at the end of the day. But businesses is to some degree the same, but it looks like it's to some degree is trying to go through that process blindfolded.
Not only blindfolded, so here's the thing. So in academia, the misguidance is that the questions they're testing for are usually whether the outcome is positive or negative has no business impact. So it doesn't result in more revenue or less revenue. You might just learn something. That's it. And it might not even be beneficial for anyone, just for the sake of knowledge. And this is even called epsilon research. It's very common. You're just in science to publish. That's it, and you do endless studies. In the business world, it's true. There is a lot of experimentation going on. But the thing is, there's very little theory. There is so little theory. And as a result, you might be asking the right question, but the way you test it is very false. It's very flawed, I would say.
Yeah. You mentioned that the transition to business was kind of like this. Whoa, this is different. I didn't expect this. The lack of structure, you could call it, in terms of creating a hypothesis, having the theory, and all this. Like, what were some of the challenges that you faced when you went from being just in academia to then transitioning over into business, trying to take the academic principles and put them into corporations, businesses, and in what you did during that transition?
Not having any experience working with big corporates at the time, the biggest challenge is communication. So I'm so used within academia to use very scientific language, trying to convince the other to try out something. So I would use very rational, technical arguments. And it turns out that those are not the arguments that actually resonate. You need to translate why a different methodology is not rational, but is something to be considered for senior people to decide on. And then you need to make what's called the business case, of course. Everyone is familiar with the business case. So you need to make a rational argument. Why should we go for this different way, this approach, in terms of cost and benefits, in revenue cost? And that it took me some time to realize, then to really be able to move the needle in trying out something else. So that for me was really a challenge.
Was this something that you just figured out through trial and error, trying the academic rational, you need to test this? Or did you have kind of like any moment where someone explicitly like told you, this is how it works?
I would get a lot of feedback like, keep it simple or don't overcomplicate. And I'm like, what are they talking about? I kept it really simple already. And I'm not overcomplicating. I'm keeping it really, really simple. But then as more I listened, I noticed that the words I'm using, the concepts I'm referring to should be different. And what I mean by that is, let me give you an example. When I do research, I like to have a better understanding what someone is willing to pay for something. And I need to keep it as simple as, do you want to go the old way, the standard way, where you just measure it based on what someone claims, and this is natively what someone is claiming is not correspond to their actual behavior, or do you want to measure their actual behavior? Now that type of language resonates a lot more with decision makers than starting to use words like, well, we need to do the methodology in an incentive compatible way. So when I use those terms, they resonate a lot with psychologists and economists, but they don't resonate at all within the business.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because one of the things in terms of figuring out pricing, I remember you touched a bit upon this last time. Like, do you actually trust when someone says, "This is what I'm willing to pay"? And one of the things that you mentioned is the skin in the game type of way of figuring that out. What is the skin in the game test for figuring out what someone is willing to pay for something?
So here's the thing. I don't want to do injustice to how the business world works. People have very huge incentives. There are big stakes to make the right decision. Huge budgets. If the project fails, it can cost a lot of money. But intuitively, we also want to go ahead and decide and make speed. So people would go for methodology where you just listen to what someone claims. Like, hey, would you buy this product or new service? They would say, yeah, of course. And say, okay, let's listen to those and make a poll and compare it with historical data. Now, within academia, we have been able to demonstrate, and we know for a fact, the discrepancy between what people claim they're gonna buy and what they actually buy. So this is a research topic on its own already, and this is called the hypothetical bias, the gap between these two what people claim and what they actually do, and it's huge. Sometimes people basically actually turns out they're not willing to pay anything for a product, but just purely to please the researcher, they would say, of course I would buy something. Now, how to solve for that? Well, the way you solve for that is introducing what's called skin in the game. And skin in the game means that you need to face the consequences of your decisions. The same way when you go to a supermarket and you need to decide on what to buy next, you need to pay for those products. They don't come, they're not free. So there's skin in the game involved when you shop for your own groceries. But how come when we do a research on a very important project, like am I gonna launch this new product or service or not? Then suddenly we remove the skin in the game and we have no clue whether people are actually going to behave like that. So what researchers have been saying, and that's also what I've been promoting, is you need to introduce skin in the game. And that means that you create a research setting where either you have people risking their own money, or you give them a budget. This is like the academic way, is you give someone a bit of money or you give them some coins, something where they need to make a trade-off. At the end of the day, an actual trade-off, so they feel the consequences. Am I gonna buy this or not? So that's one, and that result in way more realistic insights on what people are actually gonna do.
Yeah. So it's giving someone the effect that by saying what they're gonna pay, they're actually gonna pay it.
Yes. You need to basically sign a commitment. Now, the commitment can be not necessarily definitive. Like when you enter a supermarket and you buy a product, that's definitive. That means at the end of the checkout, you're gonna actually pay the amount. But you can create a research setting. You can be very creative where there's a risk of paying. So then you're already introducing skin in the game without actually a transaction needing to make happen. So for example, we often have clients that want to see whether people are willing to pay for a product that doesn't exist yet. So how are you going to test, how are you going to introduce skin in the game for a product that doesn't exist yet? And you might not even produce it, so you can't even receive pre-orders on the product. Yeah. Because I think the audience is pretty familiar with Kickstarter, where you can validate the product, but then you're also committing to actually launching it. Like I'm gonna collect pre-orders, and if I get enough pre-orders, then I'm committing to produce it. We're often dealing with clients, with companies that are not even sure whether they even want to do, whether they actually want to commit in producing the product or service. So what we'll do then instead is we'll approach a sample of people and say, hey, here's a product, and I'm asking you how much you're willing to pay for that. I'm not gonna tell you whether the product exists or not, or whether it's gonna become available or not. But if it does come into existence and you are willing to pay for it sufficiently, you will have to pay. There's a clear-cut agreement that you will have to pay for it. Now, this is a form of skin in the game that then would result in the desired insight. Like do people actually want to close this commitment or not? And that's what you want. Whether you're a big company or a small company, you want to validate whether there is real demand for your product.
Yeah. That's interesting. So basically, like, it's the commitment that, okay, I'm gonna pay, and by having that type of commitment, you emotionally go into not willing to say that you're willing to pay more than what you actually feel okay with, and the feedback someone give in terms of what they're willing to pay is going to be way more accurate compared to
yes.
I think this is what I would pay.
And here's another thing, and that's what makes it so interesting. When you ask someone the question hypothetically, would you buy this product? They often would say with the understanding, without them making it explicit, yes, at some point I can imagine myself buying this product. While the question you're actually posing is, are you willing to buy this product right now? I'm not asking. Now this is all implicit. But when you make it real, when you introduce skin in the game, you remove this implicitness. Because now you're committing to, no, you're going to pay right now. Whatever money you have in your pocket you're gonna separate ways with that money, so that I'm validating that I'm creating value for you today. And that results in a way more realistic and more honest response from the market.
Yeah. How was it received by corporates when this type of approach in terms of testing was first presented to them when you started doing this?
So initially, I might have been a bit too scientific in presenting this, but once you change the language into, listen, we can validate whether there's demand for your new product or for your new innovation. It can be even an incremental change. We're going to validate it with people voting with their own wallet, instead of just asking or having a focus group. And that, I think, for most people is intuitive. Like, of course, knowing people actually do with their own money is much more revealing than holding a focus group. I'm not saying there's no value to a focus group. A focus group can be incredibly insightful to get an understanding of the context. But the ultimate question, the one question that's on the mind of every business owner is someone going to pay for my product? Now, if you want that to be answered, and this resonates quite well. This resonates quite well, and that's also what we see. That's also how we were able to grow in offering these type of insights.
Yeah.
And also, and one thing I want to add, it took some time, even in academia, for people to be convinced of this. I mean, for a very long time, even scientific researchers, we're still using hypothetical questions to assess demand. Now it's becoming the norm. Like, no, we can only trust the data if there's skin in the game involved.
Why do you believe that it took so long for kind of like the academia world to adopt the skin in the game?
I think just the techniques, just the methodology. It has nothing to do with. So you have a couple of fields related to this: game theory, behavioral economics, cognitive psychology, and after the Second World War, there was a true renaissance. There was a true revolution and multiple revolutions where they started to say, you know what, we need to become a bit more scientific here. Don't forget. Economics used to be basically a field of philosophy, in the sense that you just had models that predicted behavior, and that's it. And then you trust those models based on face value on the theory. Now, physics by then was already doing empirical studies. Everyone knows this. That's how you had the big revolutions. You had theory by people like Einstein, but you had also other people who would actually empirically test the theories. And that's a form of skin in the game in the real world. So then there was a lag between that was introduced in physics and when that was introduced in economics and psychology.
That's interesting, because it's fascinating, and I personally am a fan of the scientific approach, because like it makes things scientific. It makes it rational. It makes it kind of factual. You can see the correlations, you can see the causations, and all of these things, instead of guessing. Because you never know if your guess is like what affects your idea to come with ideas, or your ability to come with ideas and craft a hypothesis if you don't root them in anything. It's just gut feel. But in terms of having the background in economics and transitioning from that and academic into the kind of like pricing, have you felt an experience that has given you any kind of like benefit in terms of providing this type of service and working with corporates in terms of optimizing pricing strategy, or has there been like pushback, like you're just an academic and dismissive of that?
No. In fact, quite the opposite. So academia in general is received positively. So you have an advantage there. But still, one of the challenges you're facing in academia, you're trying to convince a select few researchers with a very specific framing or understanding of the world, which is disconnected from the business reality most of the time. And that's perfectly fine, because the purpose is to gain knowledge on how the real world works. But in the business world, everyone seems to be more on the same page. Why? You're running a business, you need to increase revenue, you need to improve profitability, And everyone knows that innovation is a must. We need to come up with something that people want. So everyone's focused on that question. And then the next question is, who are we going to trust? Whose lead are we going to follow? Now, being from academia and presenting a methodology that resonates more to the intuition, because it sounds so more, it's not only it sounds more appealing, it is objectively more accurate when you stress that you put importance on measuring reality. And when I say measuring reality, try to measure reality in a realistic setting. So what does it mean? It's already an improvement if you interview your target customer instead of a student, right? If you interview a student, whether that person is going to buy your product or not, it's very biased. It's a student. It's in a particular life phase, a particular budget, income group, education level. While if you're interviewing the target customer, you're already getting closer to a realistic setting. Now, what I'm introducing is saying, hey, we want to go one step further and say, hey, we want to also have a realistic setting when it comes to the budget. We want to have and that resonates quite well. Now the challenge, however, is within business is there are usually a lot more stakeholders to convince.
Compared to academia.
Yes. So in academia, you're trying to convince. This is one or two guys in a journal that are reviewing your paper. But in the business world, it's a whole group of people that are part of the decision. And that is how we are able to, and that makes it quite different in that sense.
Yeah, it's interesting, that there's such huge difference. But then again, I guess that any field is different, and it all has its pros and cons. But interesting that was at least your experience in terms of transition from academia to business. Like, one, you need to be more like, what's in it for me, and more the emotional appeal, not necessarily just full on 100% irrational. And also the fact that there is multi-stakeholder compared to just a few.
Yes, definitely. And politics are involved as well. There are also existing vendor relationship. So running a business is very different, of course, than from being a full-time academic. So I also had to make a decision. I could definitely not do both at the same time. That would have not been possible.
Yeah. It's interesting because I've had a call with and chat with several people that has kind of like tried to do dual careers at the same time, and very varied experience in terms of being able to uphold the quality. But one of the things that I'm curious about is, how do you see what you're doing now affecting the future pricing in business? Because one of the things now is kind of like you have the consulting of pricing, but you're also moving into kind of like your B2B pricing and how companies and B2B companies price their services better. Like, how do you see this and what you're doing gonna affect the pricing strategies in companies in general?
So I started in B2C pricing because surprisingly, the problem is much easier in B2C pricing. The business model is delineated. And what do I mean by delineated? So you enter a store, the supermarket, you see a product on the shelf, you expect just one price for one item. So when we talk about pricing, you know that the format's going to be just a single price. Then we all need to decide on the unit size. We might experiment with promotions. And that's it. Those are the strict limitations. And then you have still the big challenge of measuring how much someone is willing to pay. Now, when you move to B2B, you suddenly have a much wider framework, because pricing is not necessarily one amount. Could be based on seats, could be based on recurring monthly, could be based on usage. So suddenly the spectrum, the range of possibilities goes exponential. And that makes it harder to do the empirical analysis on that, to do validation. Makes it much harder, but not impossible. But it makes it, for me as an academic, much more interesting as a problem. Where B2C seems almost like a solved problem right now. It's just a matter that more companies should be doing the right way That is
Yeah.
more the challenge there. While in B2B, I think both experts and the companies have no clue where to start and how to structure this.
Mm.
And so in that sense, there's so much more to gain there. And that also means in B2B, it's way more of an art than a science compared to B2C.
Mm.
And that's surprising because you would think, who are the old-fashioned companies? Those are the producers of physical products and whatever you
Yeah.
see in the supermarket. And the ones that are super advanced and technological and have this enormous amount of data are the tech companies. You would be surprised then when it comes to the ultimate question about how to price and monetize the products and services. They have less of a clue than those traditional companies.
So the companies that we believe have it all sorted, which is the biggest tech companies, where tech, you have all the data, you have the users' data, you have the churn, you have the retention, you have everything. They are the ones that often don't necessarily have thought this through properly. How do they typically set the price? Is it just looking at the competition, what they do price it above, price it below, or what's the experience there?
Well, that's one of the symptoms you see indeed. So here's the worst best practice. Worst best practice, you look at your cost basis and then you say, hey, I'm willing to, I'm aiming towards a profit margin of 30%, 40% or whatever percent, right? That is the absolute worst and unfortunately still taught in some schools. Then you have a majority of these tech companies say, you know what, I'm starting out, there is an incumbent leader within the space, so I just look at the way they structure their pricing and I become more competitive, right? So that is one way to go about it. But then they also make often the mistake that they might not be focused on the same persona and definitely not offer the same benefits in terms of product. So the pricing can be way off.
Mm.
And that's very problematic. And then you have companies that started out with legacy contracts. And those are also curious and they never changed. And then they want to keep it quote unquote unfair, or this is how they never lose deals, which they think is a good thing. And then they stick to the pricing for a very long time, and that is incredibly dangerous, actually.
Yeah. So if a B2B company would like to, look at, we've tried different pricing strategies. We tried copy the competitors. We tried the other one, which is the markup in terms of profit margin that we're aiming towards. None of them have really worked. What's the kind of like this simple formula for someone to kind of like get an idea? Okay, what do we want to do in terms of pricing?
I think everyone is so focused on how much to charge that they forget the one topic is what are we going to sell, how to package it. And that exercise is either skipped or not given enough attention to, because you will have most to gain from just packaging properly the solution. Because once you package it properly in a way that is convincing, you will have a much easier sell with the customer, much easier conversation, much easier upsell opportunities than just simply changing the pricing. And that is the exercise where I feel like there is so much there to gain. There's also a lot of learnings from science, but also just from the industry in terms of best practices, how to properly design the packaging of the solution. Now, a step before that even is what are you gonna package? Because I'm always surprised when we say, hey, and they would come with this list of features. And often when you go to pricing pages of companies, all they do is list features, right? Yeah. And some of these features do matter a lot. They move the needle. They're maybe even an essential requirement. And some of these features are like superfluous, like why even mention this? And this is where there's a disconnect between product engineering, I would say even, so product engineering and the commercial side, where you have a product roadmap based on some vision, product vision, but no one is keeping track of how this can be packaged, whether it should be even mentioned as part of the packaging. So when you skip that, and you even skip looking at the packaging, then no matter how you will price it, high or low, it won't matter that much because it won't resonate. It won't correspond to what your customer is willing to pay for. And that is where you have most to gain.
So you mentioned that there is plenty of science established in terms of just this thing, in terms of packaging. Like, is there one book that you would recommend someone to read in terms of learning more about this field specifically?
Oh, there are actually many books on the matter. If there was one book I would recommend, surprisingly, it would be a book by Nassim Taleb. And Nassim Taleb does not go into detail on pricing or monetization, but he has a book called On Skin in the Game. And why do I mention this book? Is it would set the framework for yourself is in how even to approach the business problem. Because that book so much focuses on how you should have a conversation with your customer, especially if you're a starting entrepreneur or you're rolling out a new way, a new feature that you want to monetize. You want to pick up the right signals from a conversation. Everyone knows you need to do user validation, and that is still something that's a good best practice. But when it comes to what to pick up from that conversation, you need to listen very carefully and knowing what questions to pose. So that's why I would recommend a book like Skin in the Game. There are other books out there that are much more like really into the content, but you need to be wary of them because they. Because there's, for example, this book which I recommend to SaaS founders called Predictable Revenue. It's written, co-authored by the founder of SaaSFounder, Jason Lemkin. And that book is great because it really gives you a sense of what success looks like. But their recommendations on pricing might come across as old-fashioned. They are too focused on seats. Just copy what your competitor is doing, and it's not going to give you the right framework to actually look critically at your own packaging. So this is why I would be a bit hesitant with like actual books that pretend to give you pricing on software pricing, because they might be outdated already by now. I mean, just in the past 2 years, so many businesses have radically changed their pricing, where seat-based was still the norm, and now suddenly it's to usage-based. So that already gives you a sense of the type of revolution is going on that you might not find back in books.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the field is moving so quickly that the books that's out there that's been maybe a couple of 2, 3, 4 years old are not keeping track.
And there's also books in between where they're more focused on product management, and those can be actually very helpful in doing the analysis, but then they often lack how it's connected to monetization.
So you get kind of like one part, but not both.
Yeah, I should be writing a book. So where I try to connect all of those because the formula within the world of software pricing is not one where look at this range, you're in this industry. No, it's a way you look at your persona, your competitors, and most importantly, in how you deliver value. And that combination. And again, this is what makes this B2B software pricing much richer in terms of which you can and also much more challenging in which you can consider than compared to B2C pricing.
Yeah, you mentioned that you want SaaS founders or founders especially to, with more clarity and understanding and certainty, put the foot on the pedal when they have the data.
I was in the pie analogy, so let me tell that story. So, as a B2B software founder, you need to make a business case. And what it means is you're offering value, you want to make it clear, because that's how you're going to convince your buyer to buy the product, because they are convinced it's going to help their business, either lowering their spend or improve revenue, either way, or maybe even both. Now that determines the size of the pie. Now, it's very painful to see how many founders don't go to the exercise of understanding how big that pie is. And it depends on not only budget, but it also depends on the type of solutions that they're able to solve with their solution. Now, once you have that, you want to be flexible enough in how you can be bought. Because everyone doesn't like paying for something that they're not going to use.
Yeah.
So if you buy fries with mayonnaise, but you don't eat mayonnaise, you might not buy it, even though the cost of the mayonnaise is maybe, basically zero. But you're like, no, I'm not going to pay for the fries with mayonnaise if it has mayonnaise, because I'm not going to eat the mayonnaise. I'm just going to eat the fries. And in software, it's very normal. You often buy products, you go to the pricing page, you see a feature mentioned, you know you're not going to use it, and then you buy it, and you feel like, I wish I didn't have to pay for that one feature, but that's how it's packaged right now. At the same time, you don't want to make it too complex. I've seen software companies that basically present you a whole menu, McDonald's menu in features. So this is the art. This is where there's so much to gain in simplifying that, in defining the personas, and making sure that people are buying the things they really want to pay for, and then when the pie is created, that you get your fair share of the pie, so that it minimizes churn, it maximizes a net retention value, and that's what B2B software founders are looking for.
Yeah, that's interesting. I gave you a heads up for a final question for a podcast, and I ask this to every single guest on this podcast. I'm curious to hear your question. And it goes like this, Anwar. If you could get an answer to one question related to your business and what you do, what would it be, and what would you like to know?
I would like to know what our customers are in the customer journey. What I mean by that is the most challenging thing I find. And you have to imagine, it's my profession to understand willingness to pay. But the trickiest thing to measure is actually not even how far someone is willing to go in terms of price, but actually where do they stand right now in the customer journey. And you would be surprised that sometimes I would be so convinced I would put all my money if I had to place a bet on it. Like, this person is willing to pay tomorrow. And then it turns out actually only in 6 months from now.
Yeah.
Now, everyone knows the pain of having a deal in your pipeline and you don't know whether it's going to close next month or in 2 months from now or in 3 months from now. And I feel like if there's one answer I would like to have is, and there was a button to it, then that's the one I would like to press. All the others I could tackle them scientifically, analytically, but this button is the one that I would love to press. And I see myself sometimes struggling with that, and see many other companies struggling with that. It's just to get a sense of timing, basically.
Yeah, it's interesting because you to some degree can scope where someone is in the buying journey, but it's impossible to understand what the time delay from transitioning from entering a stage to entering the next stage, how that is going to look like. That's interesting. Yeah, so
you can do qualification, you can size the deal, all of that, a lot of things, but timing is the one thing that I feel like, that one is really tricky.
Yeah.
Here's an idea, by the way, a wild idea for the audience. I'm seriously considering to introduce a prediction market within the company on looking at each deal and having people bet on, is this deal going to close before this date or not? Really to challenge everyone, like, hey, do you have some insight that we don't have, that you might have? Is really to challenge each other and see whether there's maybe some predictive power there.
And that would be a bit funny. I think it's a good question. I think a lot of businesses, entrepreneurs, marketers, and salespeople would love to understand that time delay for a deal to close. I've learned a ton, Anwar. Hopefully the visitors, and those who watch this on YouTube as well, find it learning, and could take a couple of golden nuggets from it, because I think the art of pricing is just that. It is an art, but it's also part of a science to it. But if you don't look at it from academia, I think a lot of business people are like, oh, it's an art, figuring out how this is. But making it tangible is useful.
Yes, and one more thing
ahead.
I'd like to add, because it's seen as an art, it's often not owned by anyone within within the company. So next time you think about pricing, you might even want to first answer the question: who is responsible for leading this? Is someone even putting this on the agenda or not? If we even want to make any improvements.
Yeah, a good final recommendation to those that listen and watch this. If someone wants to reach out, find you, learn more about the company and what you guys do, what's the best place to go to learn more and get into it?
So if you're interested in B2B software pricing, you can find me at revfixer.com. It's fixer without an E. You can also find me on Twitter or X known nowadays under the username Pricing Doctor. And you can also just simply on LinkedIn.
Yeah. So what we're going to try to do is to ensure that most of those links are in the show notes, in the description this episode is published. Anwar, it's been a pleasure to have you on. I've learned a ton. Hopefully the visitors and the viewers and the watchers found that to be as well. But it's been a pleasure to have you on, and thank you for taking part in the podcast.
Thank you.